Hello and welcome back to another entry in our series on the War in Heaven. We'll be winding down now as the war comes to a conclusion with the peace. So, let's begin. Over the war's fifth decade, the conflict reached full entrenchment. In her lecture, The Cultural Impact of Wartime, Intaradora noted that more Gallifreys had been lost than might be thought prudent. After another was lost in the Battle of Mutter's Cluster, the remaining Gallifreys, previously self-segregated, banded together and became numbered. Gallifrey 8 was covered in loom stacks and chronoforges, which provided fodder for the war. Gallifrey 9 was used to store temporal weapons such as DMAT guns, and Gallifrey 12 was used to train soldiers, including Homunculette. Around the 50th year of the war, House Linear Crook secretly organised a voyage into the Grandfather's Maw to retrieve Leviathan biodata for research. Intaradora was chosen to captain the San Greal. She betrayed Linear Crooks after going into the Maw by abandoning the mission, and trying to instead found a new universe free of the war. Linear Crooks recruited Robert Scarrat to captain the Brakespeare into the Maw, punish Intaradora, and finish her mission. Compassion witnessed a potential future where Scarrat's voyage was successful, and the biodata research led to the Time Lords harnessing the power of the Maw to obliterate Earth from history, so she contacted Scarrat before he got on the Brakespeare and showed him the consequences of success. The Brakespeare was infiltrated by agents of the Celestis, the Enemy, Faction Paradox, and Intaradora. The Brakespeare's voyage ended in a disastrous meeting with the San Greal. A TARDIS containing the severed head of Scarrat escaped and gravitated back towards the edges of the Maw, where it was found by the Time Lords in the 32nd year of the war, who learned of the entire debacle through the head's memories and prevented it from happening. Around the same time, Sabbath was appointed Godfather of Faction Paradox's military wing. He and Godfather Morlock went to 1899 England to kill Fiora Venn as part of a ritual and encountered Justine McManus. Morlock decided to let Justine join the faction, and she was sent to Dronid to learn under Sanjura. During Justine's stay, Celestis agents in the Corporation manipulated Sanjura into discovering the Relic, and he decided to respectfully send it into the Time Vortex, unaware of its true significance. It travelled to Earth, where the United States of America found it and put it in the Toy Store, their repository for alien technology. Following the 2150s Dalek invasion of Earth, it was moved to the Black Man's store within the 2169 House of Commons ruins. He sold it to Qixotl, who set up an auction for it in the unthinkable city on Earth in 2069, a ginormous ziggurat built with block transfer computation. In the 50th year of the war, Justine was summoned from Dronid back to the 11-Day Empire and sent with cousin Manuel to represent the faction at Quixotl's auction. Also invited were Unisic, who sent Lieutenant Kathleen Bregman and Colonel Joseph Armitage Cortez, the Enemy, who sent the Shift, the Celestis, who sent Trask, and the Time Lords, who sent Homunculette and his Type 103 TARDIS, Marie, from several centuries in the future of the war. Qixotl also invited the Daleks, but the Crotons overpowered their representatives and took their place. The final uninvited participants at the auction were the 8th Doctor and Sam Jones, who to Homunculette's horror was severely breaking the laws of time by attending. Though the Celestis almost obtained the relic, the Doctor tricked them into trading it to him in return for the Shift, who the Doctor had trapped in his mind. The Doctor took the relic to Koeskia and destroyed it with a thermostryson bomb. Having failed her mission through no fault of her own, Cousin Justine returned to the 11-Day Empire. In the Houses of Parliament within the Empire, the faction elders decided to try create a sentient new homeworld for the faction by sending a warship to the moment when I.M. Foreman became the biosphere of the planet Dust in the 30th century, by infecting him with a biodata virus developed by Godfather Morlock a few years prior. However, the faction didn't account for the 3rd Doctor and Sarah Jane Smith coming to Dust. Instead of infecting Foreman, the virus was attracted to the Doctor after he was shot by Magdalena Bishop. The Doctor regenerated, and the virus took hold in his body. As a result, the Doctor never stopped the 8 legs from conquering the universe. With history changing because of this, the timelines became much more uncertain and malleable. Some regions of space-time degenerated into a series of realities which formed the Obverse. The Celestis later constructed the Enclave, a pocket galaxy full of different races and cultures that separated the Obverse from the universe. a cataclysmic war began between the inhabitants of the main universe and the inhabitants of the Enclave. The Eighth Doctor, Compassion, and Fitzcriner briefly became involved with the beginning of this conflict, but they were pushed away by Iris Wildthyme. Participants in the ensuing war included the Galactic Federation, Daleks, the Glassmen of Valencia, Cybermen, Stygertrudes, Draconians, Gilligasts, Sontarans, Sambicarts, Ice Warriors, and according to many sources, several incarnations of the Doctor from the Eighth Doctor's future. Mere Cock refugees from the Enclave conflict attempted to settle on Earth in 1973, where they encountered the Third Doctor before his altered death, along with Iris Wildthyme, Joe Grant, and Thomas Daly. Iris would claim to be from the Obverse itself when not claiming to be a Gallifreyan. Outside of the war, the Obverse interacted with the outside universe during many of Iris's adventures. The pre-war era Time Lords of a Clone World Gallifrey led by Romana II became aware of the war through monitoring the Obverse and the conflict in the Enclave. Romana regenerated into a body more suitable for warfare and declared herself the War Queen and mistress of the 9 Gallifreys. In preparation for Gallifrey's darkest hour, she began stockpiling weapons in the Slaughterhouse, a secret arsenal protected by a time eddy, and she cleared whole sections of the planet to start building battle TARDISes. She planned to use bull TARDISes to mate with Compassion to create a new Type 103 TARDIS. Romana dispatched 2 of her most trusted agents, Gandar and Cavis, to capture Compassion while she transformed into a Type 103 TARDIS in Avalon. While the agents managed to almost start a nuclear war between humans and Avalonians, they did not capture Compassion, who escaped with the Eighth Doctor and Fitzcriner. After the Doctor installed a randomizer in her, Compassion managed to elude the Time Lords for a considerable time, but she was eventually found by an operative in the 19th century, Cuthbert Simpson. Compassion and her 2 companions were forced to go to Romana's Gallifrey, where they came in contact with forces from a later point in the war. In the 50th year of the war, the Book of the War, a guide to the first half-century of the war, was published. It contained a small entry on House Lolita, an obscure New Blood house which had then recently allied with House Dracolics. Godfather Morlock, head of the 11-Day Empire's bio-research wing, used a tracking knife to examine the corpse of Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler or Dracula. Among several potential timelines, he saw one where, with the assistance of a woman named Lilith, actually Lolita, Dracula survived his trip to London and infiltrated the British Empire with a fashionable new breed of vampirism. This potential timeline was blocked off at the Ghost Point by a brigade of enemy TARDISes. Gideon stole a phonograph where Morlock described his findings, and with the help of the Loa, Auteur used it as inspiration for his writings. Around the 52nd year of the war, Lolita came to the 11-Day Empire with Ruth Ventra Calixa Baxil, claiming she wanted to reinstate Faction Paradox as a proper Time Lord house. Before arriving, she hired the 79th Sontaran Assault Corps to attack the Empire. After communing with the Loa, Lolita turned on her allies and swallowed Ruthven, and the Sontarans, and the Empire itself. The only survivors were Cousin Eliza and Cousin Justine, who escaped in Ruthven's TARDIS. Its main power base lost, Faction Paradox was left fractured. As Iris Wildthyme put it, the ashes of the faction were scattered across the universe, the scant surviving members crawling into untraceable holes, biding their intangible blades until the pointless war concluded. Surviving groups included the inhabitants of the Shadowspire, Mother Mathara's army, and the Boulevard of Alternate Brutalities. There were also 3 separate faction groups, all unaware of each other, surviving in 21st century America, and multiple individuals wrongly believing themselves to be the last vestiges of the faction. With the faction out of the picture, the Time Lords began threatening the Osirian court. In response, Sutekh brought his armies of Malak to the area around the Mediterranean Sea in the 15th century, a crucial point in history. The Time Lords sent Meritria Elenia to influence the humans into destroying the Malak, but she was captured. The Time Lords were forced to agree to a peace treaty to keep history intact. In the treaty, they rededicated the Faction Paradox Shrine in Civita to Sutekh. After Sutekh killed his brother Osiris, he smashed the shrine's remembrance tanks and buried his corpse underneath. Osiris's biodata spread into the infant inhabitants of the tanks, upwards into the Tree of Filth, and out into the bugs of the hours, and throughout the Italian countryside. Corwin Marn and his wife Astarte took a baby from one of the tanks and adopted it as their daughter. After Lolita ended the 11-Day Empire, most of the other houses wanted to ally with her. With the War King's Gallifrey practically under her control, she began trying to expand her influence throughout the Spiral Politic. she planned to occupy millions of bodies in powerful positions on every important planet in every time zone, controlling history like one great big nervous system. Lolita began with Earth in 1762, overlaying her identity on Queen Charlotte's mind, putting George III in a natural time envelope so that he wouldn't notice the changes in his wife, and importing from the 51st century an arming of Peking homunculi, keying to her central processor. Cousins Justine and Eliza came to 1762 and encountered Mary Culver, who was used by Compassion to inform them of Lolita's presence. With the help of Lord Sandwich and the Sieur d'Eon, Eliza destroyed the homunculus army, loosening Lolita's hold on the Era. Lolita also tried to take control of history in 21st century America, where, as Libertarian Arizona Congresswoman Lola Dennison, she orchestrated Matt Nelson's presidential campaign. While he still lost the Democratic Party nomination, as the patterns of the spiral politic would suggest, instead of his campaign dwindling, he founded the Radical Party and selected Lola as his vice presidential candidate. Lolita also gave Richard Francis Burton the 1002nd Night while he travelled in Arabia in the 1840s. The story contained a prophecy that would inspire Dave Larson to assassinate Nelson at his inauguration. At the time, several of the minor wartime powers had influences on 21st century Earth. There were at least 3 faction paradox groups, all unaware of each other, and the Celestis had control of one of the major governments. When the slope of Earth's history, which had been flat since the Ghost Point at the start of the century, started to bend upwards, either the Time Lords or the enemy sent an agent to investigate. The agent tracked the disruption to Nelson's campaign, but when Lolita discovered them, she turned them into a shift. The shift tried persuading Larson to kill Lola instead by telling him about Lolita's murders of young women along the campaign trail, but Larson only became more determined. After he killed Nelson, Lola Dennison became president and announced the Caldera Project, through which she intended to reshape history by drilling into the caldera hidden under the Earth's crust. The following Earth year, a number of books which had been buried since falling to Earth as a meteor in the 18th century were unearthed. They included the Infinite Book of Books, as well as the Faction Paradox series, a cache of entirely accurate books about the war which originated in another reality where it was fiction. Learning of this, multiple war powers, including the Time Lords, Faction Paradox, and Ashlar Shock Troops, descended on the New York Public Library to retrieve the books and the intelligence they contained. However, they were also sought out by people from 10,000 Dawns, including spies from the Great Assimilation and the Arbiter of Knives, a high-ranking member of the Firmament, who were to their reality as the Time Lords were to this one. The latter's agent, responsible for watching out for interlopers from beyond the war's universe, were bribed by the Arbiter to overlook events in the temporal orbit of Rachel Edwards, who was covering the book's discovery for her newspaper for a few days, allowing the Arbiter to gain entry to the library. There she incapacitated the War Powers agent, negating their ability to regenerate so long as she was in the room, with the exception of the Strid, an opportunistic body-snatching species who had reached the books first. In the end, however, Rachel prevented the books from being acquired by any of the parties present, forcing the interdimensional visitors to retreat. Before she left, Arbiter warned her that the Time Lords would probably track her down and erase her memory of these events. In expectation of this, she wrote them down and hid many copies in various places around her home and the city. In 1762, Sabbath Day was inspired by Cousin Justine's actions to perform a supplication ritual which transformed him into an agent of the Time Lords. Sabbath put Justine on trial for the crimes of Grandfather Paradox, sentencing her to finish the grandfather's sentence on Sharda. 6 months after Justine was imprisoned, Compassion possessed a guard and released Demetra Kine of the Blood Coteries to cause chaos through which Justine could escape. Kine took control of the prison and attempted to take revenge on Shunkucker, another surviving member of the faction. After teaming up with Shunkucker to kill Kine, Justine escaped in a TARDIS just before Time Lord soldiers arrived to disband the riot. In the time that Justine was in prison, a lot happened back on Earth in the 1760s. Before Justine left, Compassion had been convinced that a great fight would be needed to stop Lolita from taking over Earth. Justine returned in 1763. By the end of that year, she and Eliza were no longer in contact with Compassion, and no longer worried about Lolita taking over the 18th century. However, Compassion remained an active force in the war, in the 58th year bringing an end to the City of the Saved Civil War. At a time that the shift described as years in the future of the period covered by the Book of the War, a team of 12 Time Lords, including Zeneria, Holstrad and Alopta, were sent to Antarctica in 12 million BCE to prepare an assault on Planet 5 to capture the Fendahl so that it could be re-engineered into a final assault weapon for the war. Because the Celestis had used a fictional generator to bring to life the Elder Things from H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, the Time Lords regenerated into bodies which resembled Elder Things to blend in. The Eighth Doctor, Compassion and Fitzkriner, came to the Time Lord base to investigate the Elder Things. The Time Lords were about to break through the temporal barrier around Planet 5 by barraging it with kamikaze war TARDISes, but Compassion's presence inspired them to break free of their servitude. Takon tried to restrain the TARDISes with a DMAT gun and was forced to shoot the lead TARDIS, rupturing it. The damaged TARDIS spread into a time fissure stretching from 12 million BCE to 1999. In the 1970s, Professor Fendelman used the energy of this time fissure to reanimate the final fragment of the Fendahl. The Fourth Doctor and Leela arrived at Fendelman's lab and prevented the Fendahl from fully manifesting. They dumped the Fendahl fragment in Cantharis, where, according to some accounts, it was found by the Daleks and re-encountered by the Eighth Doctor and Lucy Miller. Another indicated it drifted to Kaldor and caused its destruction, although the Eighth Doctor suspected that Livchenko's return to Kaldor changed history, and another account of that period of Kaldor history suggested that it was not destroyed by the Fendahl. Freshly returned from a disastrous mission on Delphon, where he desperately tried to use his eyebrows to get the local Delphons to attack the enemy, Homunculus was sent by the War King to station himself in 1999 under the alias Nathaniel Hume to investigate the fissure and other remnants of what was going on in 12 million BCE. Compassion and Holstrud followed the TARDIS to 1999, where they encountered Hume and fought too. Back in the past, the Eighth Doctor convinced all the TARDISes not to break the shield around Planet 5, but one TARDIS accidentally did, unleashing the Fendahl Predator. Just as the Hermit planned, the Predator was attracted to Mictlan, home of the Celestis. The Predator feasted on the Celestis, utterly destroying them. The Doctor coordinated the TARDISes into working together to push Mictlan away from the main universe, so that the Predator wouldn't be able to return. The Shift, who attended the Relic auction, managed to escape the dying Mictlan with several other Celestis servants by hijacking one of the TARDISes. They landed on a world at the beginning of the Spiral Politic, where the Shift eventually found its way into a copy of the Book of the War. Following the failed Fifth Planet Gambit, Zenaria was regarded as a war hero and given the honorary title of Zenaria Who Survived. In 1763, a group of Malak left over from Sutek's activity in the 15th century were led by Myrtra Elenia to Italy to use an Osirian lodestone to open a time tunnel to Upuat. Members of the Society of Sigismondo di Rimini summoned Justine and Eliza to help them deal with the Malak, and they successfully stopped Elenia. However, after Corwin Mon took Justine and Eliza to the defiled faction shrine in Civita, Justine allowed Myrtra to open the corridor, and she herself travelled through it to the ship of 1 billion years. Eliza collected fragments of Osiris's scattered biodata, while as a diplomat in the Osirian court, Justine recruited Anubis to build a new body for Osiris with a remembrance tank. Lolita told Sutek about Justine's plan, and he sent the ship of 1 billion years to destroy them at Anubis's laboratory. Realizing that she had run out of time to collect the final pieces of biodata, Eliza sacrificed herself to become the host for Osiris's resurrection. However, since the Time Lord diplomat Mortega was also being threatened, the War King rescued them with the 59th Time Fleet. During this confrontation, Lolita snuck into the laboratory and contributed some of her own biodata to the resurrecting Osiris. Osiris's resurrection within Eliza's body was complete, and he was accepted by the Osirian court as Horus. Horus overpowered Sutek using his power derived from Lolita's biodata, as Lolita planned to rule the Osirian court through Horus. The War King brought Justine back to Gallifrey and tried to give her House Paradox's old seat on the War Council, but Lolita challenged the War King's judgment, rallying public support behind her. As Justine fled Gallifrey, Lolita devoured him and became War Queen. The War King would later attempt to escape Lolita's interior using Sabbath Day, but did not succeed. After Sutek and Horus both agreed that the Osirian throne would go to the victor of a time war, Justine and Horus worked together to capture Sutek and Lolita in a temporal trap that ended with Sutek's imprisonment in a pyramid and Horus's death after using his army of 700 Osirians to deal with Lolita. After this, he told Justine that she would no longer be a problem for them. Indeed, this time war was partially fought on 18th century Earth, where Compassion previously predicted the last stand against House Lolita would be made. Justine found a new home for Faction Paradox in the aftermath of Elizabeth Hawkins and James Braddock's experience in Shrines. When inducting his earlier self into the faction, Francis Burton made himself swear by Horus, the reborn child from whose sacrifice the faction owes its rebirth. The Nibiru developed a taste for paradox energy after their home planet was drenched in the fallout of a ruptured TARDIS, leading them to begin hunting down the members of the faction. After capturing some Nibiru to learn of their motives and capabilities, the faction decided to fight the Nibiru traps with a larger trap of their own, the Armistice. Faction agents, disguised as acting troops, were sent across the galaxy to spread news of the peace. One such troop, consisting of Mullion, Amara, Axastiaski, Hole, and Kabe Mao, were tasked by their elders with reconstituting 3 individuals by speaking their words. The words were actually from the troop's personal future, when they were torn apart by internal conflict and the survivors were killed by Nibiru. The faction also experimented with technology to alter the perceptions of millions at once, using a remote colony world. This secret project was overseen by Satyavan, who had ulterior motives in resurrecting his civilization of origin, which was erased from time. Satyavan refused to report of the technology's success to the faction, and many faction agents were sent to the planets and killed by remote. Mers investigated, and learned that Satyavan was the pawn of lost souls resembling shadows who had been erased from time and wished to return, and took his place as overseer. Mars was left in temporal turmoil by the battle between Sutekh and Horus, as well as experiments by the Time Lords and the influence of the Book of the Enemy. As a result, the Ice Warriors found themselves fighting for historical existence. Several were recruited by Faction Paradox, including Gustave, who fled from the chaos of Mars. Thousands of Life's Angels began spreading news of the war's end to mortals and immortals alike, at one point appearing before Intrepid, Kiffer and Gustave at the Shadow Spire. Sometime after this, the Battle of Kratoski Fields was fought. Cortalian held the first auction in heaven on Krakoum, which ended in chaos when Kiffer and Gustave unleashed the frozen Battle of Kratoski Fields, and Auteur tried to become beyond time by merging with a Pep. Sponsored by the Nibiru, Huxley sent Wade, Nez, Tambril Savora Vitas, and a shift to the Time Lord base on RMS in the Amazolian system to steal the Greater Key, where they all died in an encounter with an enemy conceptual predator. A Nibiru the faction had trapped in a dead time containment field on Dust was released and tricked by cousin Persephone into seeking the Book of the Peace. The Nibiru arrived in a faction-made simulation based on the Yeag letters and encountered a foe William Burroughs. Prevented from extensively examining the Book of the Peace by Burroughs, the Nibiru was left convinced the armistice was real, even though it knew no details. It returned back to its people, who then believed that with the war over, Faction Paradox were the last remaining source of paradox energy. The faction proceeded to hold a ritual to get all its members to gather on Dust, so the Nibiru would swarm there. While the Nibiru were distracted, Zakobo Agi harnessed the power of the Paradox Eater to change the Nibiru's history so that they never came to hunger for paradox energy. The Nibiru and Dust all became paradoxes themselves, and destroyed each other in the storm of cannibalization. Thus, the purpose of the armistice was fulfilled. At a time towards the end of the war, when it had been going on for around 292 years and the Celestis were long dead, there arrived a militaristic faction paradox war fleet led by Mathara, coming from the destruction of the 11-Day Empire in the war's past, bringing with them a piece of the Empire and a false grandfather paradox. To be precise, he was a version of the 8th Doctor, completely changed by the biodata virus, who took on the title of Grandfather Paradox. The Time Lords of this era were losing the war. On one Gallifrey, misinformation camps and carefully detonated reality bombs were used to obscure certain truths from the majority of Gallifreyans. Biological defences created in ancient Gallifreyan history to combat the Great Vampires and the Charon were augmented to have devastating capabilities against the enemy. The faction warfleet travelled to Romana III's Gallifrey just before the start of the war, at the same time that Compassion was forcibly taken to the planet with the 8th Doctor and Fitzkriner inside of her. The pre-war 8th Doctor was on the verge of being overtaken by the faction biodata virus at that time. The faction successfully took the capital by force. They resurrected Greyjan the Sane using a remembrance tank, and had him take Romana's place as Lord President. The nature of Greyjan's previous presidency meant that Gallifrey began merging with the 11-Day Empire. Using their newfound control over the web of time, the faction began altering the history of Romana's Gallifrey, erasing 5 of the 6 founders of Time Lord Society, and undoing the creation of the 8 copies of Romana's Gallifrey. But there was one variable that the faction did not account for: the Doctor's original TARDIS, previously devastated by Lolita in the events that led the Doctor to start travelling in Compassion, containing within it the potentiality of the timeline where the Third Doctor regenerated due to radiation from Metebelis 3, and was never infected with the biodata virus. The stress of containing this timeline warped the TARDIS, turning it into the vast edifice which loomed in the sky above Gallifrey. The Eighth Doctor journeyed into the heart of the edifice, where he had a confrontation with Grandfather Paradox. The Doctor chose to use the unstable power of the edifice to restore the Metebelis timeline and erase Romana's Gallifrey from history, to spare its inhabitants from the rule of Faction Paradox and the horrors of the war. The ensuing explosion eradicated the entire sector of space containing Castorberus, and with it the Faction Warfleet. All the surviving Time Lords of the destroyed Gallifrey either fled to other clone worlds or fell from the war to be among the lesser species, their timelines rotting and their second hearts decaying due to their connection to a dead world. Compassion rescued the Eighth Doctor, Fitz and Nivet from the destruction of Gallifrey. She believed that this meant the war was over, but would have significant further involvement in the war. The Eighth Doctor then lived through a century on Earth, after which he and Fitz found themselves in a post-war universe. Multiple later incarnations of the Doctor would go on to have further involvement in the war, further tangling the timelines. The Faction Paradox Warfleet crumbled out of the spiral politic, but survived as Clockwork temporal viruses. At an earlier point in his timeline, the Eighth Doctor found himself in the war era and tried to send a hypercube to his Gallifrey for help with the boy, a member of Faction Paradox in 2002 San Francisco. While the Doctor believed that hypercubes were impossible to intercept, the boy did just that. When asked how he did it, the boy replied, "Maybe there's no one home on Gallifrey. Or maybe the whole planet's being destroyed, undestroyed, and destroyed, and you just caught them at the wrong moment." At a time when the Time Lords had been fighting the war for half a millennium, the Time Lord military was on its last wave, but this time the original Gallifrey was known to have been wiped from existence, along with most of its population. In this era, the High Council sent Homunculette on Marie on a mission to obtain the Relic, so its biodata could be examined to further the war effort. Homunculette saw the Relic as the final chance to win the war. After first encountering the Black Man in 2169 London, they went to Quixotl's auction, where they failed to secure the Relic. With no other options, the Time Lords adopted a strategy of mutually assured destruction. They created Anathema, a planetary warship with the cold at its centre, designed to destroy Earth, the enemy's supposed planet of origin, in the late 20th century, and therefore destabilise the causal nexus of the universe. In order to get past the enemy defences, Anathema was sent to Earth not with time travel, but with sub-light speed space travel along a 3 billion year route from a Time Lord base. The Time Lords then evacuated the universe. Compassion heard rumours involving something about a universe in a bottle. In fact, they stole I.M. Foreman's bottle universe while the Eighth Doctor was visiting her. There were already Time Lords in Foreman's bottle universe, who evacuated into their own bottle universe when the gods of Della began taking over their universe. Christine Summerfield theorised that the gods were actually the Time Lords from the universe outside Foreman's bottle universe. However, other sources indicated that the gods were actually the Ferritu, and that the universe invaded by the gods was the same one in which the war occurred. As the warship began nearing the end of its 3 billion year journey, Faction Paradox of an earlier period in the war established a remote colony on the warship. When Anathema finally did reach Earth, it was disarmed by the Eighth Doctor. Enterradora believed that the war would be ended by either the entire war's retroactive annulment, or a victory for one side so complete that it would become true history. By one account, the war was retroactively annulled by the Eighth Doctor, erasing Romana III's Gallifrey from history. However, in the post-war universe, there was still evidence that the conflict had lasted many generations. Some members of the Time Lords believed that the war would end after the 7 prophesized heads of Severance spoke. In a deleted scene of Majun, the Ghost Kingdom, Baron Amatsumara said, "When the 7th head speaks, the war will end, and the true war will begin." In the Book of the Truce, Godfather Morlock wrote that the war could be ended by placing all of its participants in Oxbow realities. Some optimistic thinkers thought that the war would resolve itself if only a few key figures were trapped in Oxbow realities. On the 18th of March 2005, Madame Blavatsky warned Panda, "The war is ending. It will be happening soon, or recently, or always has." According to one tour operator who took advantage of Gallifrey's fall from grace to organise time tourism into its history, the War in Heaven was similar in nature to the monk's description of a change war, a conflict where both participants constantly went back and rewrote their entire part in the war, meaning it had no fixed history or conclusion, except that instead of staying static, the war was constantly getting shorter. This process became complete in the span of time between the tour operator beginning to explain it and then finishing, forcing them to cancel all tours of this era of Gallifreyan history. And that is how the War in Heaven ended, or rather didn't, as it may still be ongoing in the background, truly never ending on another plane of existence. Next time we'll be finishing our series by going into the aftermath of the war in a post-war universe. But anyways guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, then consider leaving a like and subscribing down below, as it really helps out the channel. And if you do subscribe, then make sure to click the little bell and turn on notifications so you're notified when the final part comes out. But as always, thanks for watching.